Greetings, friends, and welcome to Telling Our Stories, an oral history workshop being led by Dr. Gillian Frank. I'm Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of today's program. LGBTQIA is committed to preserving and telling the stories of persons from a wide expanse of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. We commend you for joining us to learn more about how you can help us gather those stories. Today, Dr. Frank will lead us in discussion about methodological and ethical approaches undertaking queer and religious oral history research. He will cover a wide range of topics related to oral histories of LGBTQIA religious subjects. Dr. Frank will tell you more about that. Gillian Frank, Ph.D., is an assistant professor of history at Trinity College Dublin and the director of the Center for Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Trinity College Dublin. He is the author of numerous academic articles on the histories of sexuality, gender, and religion, which have appeared in venues like the Journal of the History of Sexuality, American Jewish History, and Gender in History. He also writes public-facing scholarship with bylines in publications including the Washington Post, Time, Jezebel, and Slate. Through his column at The Revealer, More Than Missionary, Frank regularly writes about the intertwined histories of religion and sexuality. Frank's oral history work can be heard on his podcast, Sexing History, which explores how the history of sexuality shapes our present, and Red State Religions, which explores the persistence of liberal people of faith in conservative spaces. And now, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Gillian Frank to Telling Our Stories, an oral history workshop.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, Mark, for introducing me. What a delight to be with you on this beautiful, at least over here, beautiful summer day. So greetings from Dublin. I hope you are all well. So let's talk about the menu for today. We're going to break this workshop into 4 basic sections. What is oral history and why we do it? That will be the first one. We'll zoom through that fairly briefly. We're going to talk about preparing for the interview. And then we'll talk about the interview itself, and then post-interview miscellany, things such as archiving, backing up, things of that sort. So let's just talk about oral history and why we do it. So in LGBTQ history in particular, but in studies of folks who have been neglected or otherwise marginalized, and even folks who haven't, oral history is a field of study and a method for gathering, preserving, and interpreting the voices and memories of people, communities, and participants in past events. For LGBTQ history, it was and is a primary methodology. Oftentimes, in the past, we would encounter LGBTQ voices through basically institutions who have produced records about them. Oftentimes, historically, these were hostile institutions, the state, medical apparatuses, and so forth. Later on, when we created alternative institutions, whether it was museums or various queer organizations, we could capture our own voices in these ways or have our voices captured in friendly ways. But oral history became a primary way of supplementing voices that were often marginalized, pathologized, or relegated as unimportant. It became a method in a way to make the archive much more robust and more holistic, to welcome voices who might not be captured by what we would say dominant, and even we can say oppositional institutional practices and organizations. I want us to think about oral histories in this way. I want us to think about them as co-created documents. And I'm going to say that again because this is really key. Oral histories are co-created documents. It's a collaborative process between the interviewer and the narrator. It is something we do together. The questions evoke a response. The response evokes more question. At its best, it's dialogic. And we set the table for our interviewee to share their stories in ways that dignify them and allow them to dilate so that they can bring themselves to the interview. And we'll talk about the sort of ways in which we structure the interview in a moment. The other thing I would say is that oral histories are reliant on memory and the weirdness of memory. We get recollections of events, we get perspectives, we get, and this is really key, feelings about the past. And the unique value of oral history is not about the facticity of them. Just like any other document, they can be problematized. They're the result of bias. It can be shaped by the mood of the day. It can be shaped by the weather. But oral histories are valuable in what they reveal about how narrators make meaning out of their lives, their memories, and stories. Oral histories capture recollections about the past, filtered through the lens of a changing personal and social context. We think about the past in relationship to our present, and so our conversations and questions at a particular moment will evoke a particular set of stories, which is to say, like any other historical methodology, they can produce beautiful artifacts, but it is always flawed and always needs to be correlated to other forms of documentation. I want us to also think about oral history in two ways for our purposes. One is a life history, and the other is a project or research focused history. And if you go to the LGBTQIA website, you'll see a bit of both. Life history often documents an individual subject's history. It often can be a VIP or someone whose life is worth telling as much as we can from the beginning of their memories to the present day. We can think of it as sort of like an important founder of an organization, a politician, someone who, again, is a VIP. It usually consists of multiple interviews. It's usually chronological, beginning from childhood and moving forward in time. It can have thematic segments. Again, it's usually high-profile subjects. It is biographical in a sense. Overlapping with this, but also separate, is a project-focused or a research-focused history. This can focus on specific research questions. It might be organized around a specific synagogue or church. It could be organized around an event, right? Who was at this particular protest or this particular congregation? It can be organized thematically, right? HIV in synagogues during a particular era. And the narrator's relationship to the topic is more important than their status. It's not about VIPs, it's about the theme or the subject. And usually that interview is part of a larger project that documents many experiences. So for example, I'm currently completing a book about clergy who helped people get abortions before Roe v. Wade. I've interviewed over 100 people for it, and what draws them all together is their participation in an underground abortion religious network. That's the thematic connection, an institution, an act, and a time period. Now, I could focus on one of those subjects and try to tell their life story, but that wouldn't be the purpose of that particular project. So, we do these kinds of oral histories because we believe that we can learn about a topic by listening to, and I mean listening to, and documenting the experiences of people whose daily lives are shaped by their relationship to that topic, whether that's queer religion, whether that is, again, reproductive politics, whether it's about labor in our institutions. We dignify people and we think about them as having something to share from their memories and everyday lives. Put it really succinctly, oral history is really a successful means of obtaining information about communities, about individuals, and supplementing broader institutional and cultural narratives. So, one of the things, and I'm going to move on in a second, but I want to just say is oral history for me its value lies in the way it helps me place people's experiences within a larger social and historical context, but also in how their experiences transforms my understanding of that context. I can document individual or collective experiences, but my understanding of social forces gets transformed in those conversations. You get a depth of emotion, it personalizes it, and oftentimes, and we'll talk about this more in a few minutes, interviewees will bring their own documents from their own archives to help us enrich our own research. So, despite the fluid nature of oral histories, right, a co-created process, something that you see as dialogic and interactive, it's a process that's always grounded in thoughtful planning, research, and careful preparation as we go into the interview itself. So we're going to go to part 2 now and talk about planning. So the first thing we need to do when we plan an oral history project is we have to define our boundaries. Now keep in mind, boundaries will shift as we go. Part of the dialogue is that we expand our vision or contract it as need be. But having a clearly defined boundary is very helpful in keeping oral history projects manageable. The boundary, for example, can be an institution. For example, the people who founded and joined the first queer synagogue in San Francisco in the 1970s. That would be a boundary. It could be a theme, gay and lesbian weddings at Unitarian Universalist churches in the 1990s. It can be an event, say a drag ball, a dance, a riot. It can be an important person, for example, the author of an important work of trans theology. It can be a geography, for example, queer religions in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the early 2000s. That was also geography and a chronology. But having a boundary, thematic, institutional, geographical, biographical, and especially chronological, is really key to anchoring your project and giving it direction. Now, as we think about queer religious oral histories, we should always think about there's a process of inclusion, who we ask and who we invite, and who we imagine participating, and those who might fall by the wayside. Now, my experience, and I've been doing oral histories for about 2 decades now, and I've been involved in various queer projects, religious projects, history of sexuality projects, and a smattering of others. My experience, oral history studies of LGBTQIA life tend to skew to those who pridefully claim those identities. I'll say that again. These oral history projects tend to skew to those who claim those identities, who imagine themselves as parts of those communities. So the histories of those who choose to be discreet, who are closeted, those who only engaged in same-sex sexual behavior for a period of time, those who would rather not identify, those who would pass as straight or as a gender not of their origin, often don't get captured in these histories. And it's worth remarking upon that the communities that we capture are not always perfectly contained and that there are going to be people who get left out. Now, when it comes to religiosity and religious identity, it's a bit more capacious. As some of you might know from your own experiences, there's a lot of people whose faith of origin, whose religious journey is complicated, that they might have a hostile or complex relationship with their faith. And oftentimes they are much more willing to participate in these conversations. So these sort of effects of thinking about religion and sexuality together, they're sort of a countervailing movement, whereas folks might be very sort of distant or antagonistic with their faith of origin, might have a very complex religious journey. They indeed might have a very complex sexual journey, but the prideful identification tends to skew in terms of sexual identity. Okay, putting that aside, and I'm just sort of marking boundaries in the thought process as we define our terms, as we look for our subjects, by defining the object of our study, we need to be prepared to expand the boundaries as guided by our interviewees. We do that by asking folks things like, who else should I speak to in order to learn more? And we'll come back to that later. But oftentimes, our field of knowledge and vision expands or contracts based upon the conversation. Okay, shifting gears a little bit. So that's the sort of theoretical mechanism as we think about our objects and our subjects. But now we need to think about preparing for our interview. You're going to hear a little bit of ambient noise in the background. I have a giant Great Dane. He's sound asleep. He's snoring. So if you hear a snoring noise, that's just the big fella in the back. His head will pop up now and again. This is just the joy of working from home. You hope that when you do an oral history, there's no interruptions like this, but we'll leave that aside. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to locate potential narrators. Now, if you want to participate in the chat And if you're imagining your oral history, here's my question to you. Where would you begin to locate people you want to interview? For me, when I've done campus oral histories, I might begin with yearbooks or institutional records. If I were doing a religious institution, I might look at church or synagogue bulletins. I might look at news reports. I might look at membership records. I might look at blogs or memoirs. These are all starting places. I wonder where you might look. I've also used things like, and again, you can put your comments in the chat, but in the past, I've also done things like written an article. So I wrote an article for my current project on the clergy consultation service on abortion for Time magazine. And at the end of it, I put my email address and contact info. The editors were gracious enough to allow me to include that. And basically it generated, half a dozen more interviews as people read it and contacted me and said, hey, I was part of this organization. I've also done things like, so for my podcast, Sexing History, we were doing this history of breast enlargement devices in the 1950s and 1960s, and we wanted to find people who used these bogus devices. We ended up finding an interviewee because she wrote a story about it in a Chicken Soup for the Soul anthology. We found her author profile online, we contacted her, and she interviewed with us. I've had colleagues take out advertisements in LGBTQ newspapers saying, I'm doing this interview. I've known people to put out calls for interviewees in local organizations. So there's lots of possibilities, but we cast a wide net. You can also Google stalk to find people's emails and phone numbers. And there's, of course, what we call snowballing. You find one or two people and you ask them, have you kept in touch with anyone? Who else should I interview? Now, again, one of the things that we want to do, say we found our people, we have their contact info. Ideally, you'll send them an email or in an old-fashioned way, a snail mail, but oftentimes it's email, and you introduce yourself. You say who you are, you talk about, and again, this is making first contact. So if you want to put a subheader for the section, it's called first contact. You talk about the purposes of the project. You say, I would like to do an interview. You talk about where it might take place. Will it be online? Will it be in person? And that's something to negotiate in the follow-up phone call. You give your contact information and you tell them what it's for. So again, you want to be as open and transparent as possible. And if you belong to an institution like a university, you should check in before you make the first contact about what your institution's protocols are. Now, I'm in Ireland. Our protocols here are radically different than the North American one. For you all, it's quite literally the Wild West. You can pretty much, in most institutions, oral history is treated as not in the scope of IRBs, but it is always good to double check and to make sure you're following best practices of oral history. The Oral History Association also has a number of best practices listed on their website, and much of what I'm talking about is reinforcing and dilating from that. But again, first contact should be preceded by just, if you're a part of an institution, double checking what the protocols are. And again, that first contact is, hello, I'm so-and-so. I'm doing research on X and Y. I would love to interview about it and to hear your story. Here's my contact information. Would you be willing to be interviewed? If they don't have an email address that you can find and you can get a phone number somehow, and there's all sorts of online sites like White Pages, Taldire, all sorts of other things, a cold text message, or at worst, Lord help us, a cold phone call can be used as a last resort. And again, you have to be gracious and polite and introduce yourself. After you've made that contact and say they are intrigued enough to sort of say, yeah, I'd love to be interviewed or I'd like to hear more, I can't recommend this enough. Schedule a pre-interview over Zoom so they can see your face, or some people don't have that technology, so a phone call is appropriate. You meet people technologically where they are. But this pre-interview session is really important. It sets the tone. It allows you also, and this is really key, to do a quick diagnostic of how they are. Some people aren't always compos mentis. They're not always in full and good mental health. I work with an elderly population, and sometimes I've had to not do interviews because they couldn't give informed consent and share their story with me. You can also get a sense of their tone and tenor. So it's really important to have that first interview. But this first pre-interview allows for an exchange of information. You'll talk about possible topics and questions, your reasons for conducting the interview, how it will go. Will you use Zoom? Will you use a phone call? Will you meet in person? And you'll talk about the need and go over the need for informed consent and talk about legal release forms. So, oral history release forms, and these are, you're going to see, I bet, on our own website, but I will put one in the chat in a few minutes, are really key so that you explain in writing to your interviewee what this is about and make sure that they understand that they are giving you permission and certain kinds of permission to use their story. Now, this release form and this pre-interview do the same thing, but we are basically making sure, and this is about informed consent and ethics, that we're stating the oral history's purposes and procedures and how the interview will be used. So what are the aims and how might it be used? Will it be used for a podcast? Will it appear on a website? Will it be embargoed for a while? You will discuss their rights to the interviews, including their right to edit it or set access restrictions to sort of set the terms of dissemination and to limit or give permission for its distribution, whether it's online or on a broadcast. And you should have the expectation, and you should convey the expectation, that their recordings will remain confidential until they've given permission via the oral history release form. Now, I'm going to put in the chat a sample oral history release form. This is a little dated, but you should be able to see it now. It's in the chat. Now, again, folks can sign these forms electronically. As long as you have that email, it's sufficient. Now, one of the things that you absolutely should do in that pre-interview is you have to explain to them that they'll have the right to discuss or not discuss certain subjects, to restrict access to the interview, to choose anonymity or pseudonymity. And some folks might not want their names used in public. This is totally fine, and you can work with them to come up with a pseudonym. So for example, I've interviewed numerous people who have had abortions, and they don't want their name shared. It's a confidential moment in their life, but they want their stories told. So we come up with the terms by which their stories will be shared. I've also interviewed clergy, for example, who are now affiliated with Catholic institutions, but who gave abortion advice and referrals back in the 60s and 70s. They don't want their name shared for fear of losing their pensions. So there are real ethical concerns oftentimes about sharing people's identities, and you must always get their permission about how to use their name and where their story can appear. So in the chat, you'll see a sample oral history form. Okay, so again, just a quick summary. During this pre-interview, you're going to discuss format of the interview, location of the interview, duration of the interview, and I recommend setting 60 to 90 minutes. Most people don't like to talk for longer than that, but you'd be surprised some people will go for hours and hours, and you might have to exit yourself. How the interview will be recorded, informed consent, and also what you will do with the interview and how you will preserve it. And again, you need to see if your home institution has guidance and guidelines for these projects. And this will vary again by institution and by region. Different countries have different protocols. Over here in Ireland, it is so much more strict than the United States. Okay, so if at any point, again, if you have questions for me, feel free to drop them into the chat. So by now, we've talked about some of the theories and rationale behind oral history, beginning to look for subjects, defining the scope of our oral history projects, and then making first contact, as well as oral history release forms. I'm going to put another document in the chat. You do not need to look at it right now, but this is the basics of oral history guidelines, and I will put it again in the chat at the end of our conversation today. Now, you found your subject, you've made first contact, you've gone over with them some potential topics, Some of them might want to see some questions in advance. Others will want to just sort of do extemporaneous conversations on the day of. But we're never totally extemporaneous when we go into oral histories. We have to prepare for our moment with our subjects because their time is valuable and their stories are valuable, and we want to be our best so we can bring out their best stories. So, what do we do as historians and people who are passionate about queer history, about religious history? We do our research so that we can ask historically significant questions, reflecting careful prep and an understanding of our subjects and the issues to be addressed. What is the first thing we do? We Google stalk our person. We do research on them. We do research on the topic and the larger context in both primary sources, so we can look at primary source newspapers, yearbooks, church bulletins, synagogue bulletins. We can also read about the subject at hand. What was Unitarian Universalism like in the 1980s? What's been written about it? Try to learn as much about your subject as possible and about the context for their lives as relevant to your research project. We don't go in cold, and we have as much info as we can so we can ask questions and make the most of our time together. But here's the other thing, and this is really key. When we start doing primary source research, and you can use paid for sites like newspaperarchive.com or newspapers.com, you can see what the internet itself yields. You can see what your institutional databases, if you're lucky enough to have them, might yield for you. But oftentimes, this will yield objects, whether it's a newspaper article or a picture or a song. I interviewed a number of folks who were danced on American Bandstand in the 1950s and 1960s. These were gay and lesbian dancers, and they brought their own scrapbooks to the interview. But these objects are great things to become aids to memory. They offer what we call memory cues. And again, these could include scrapbooks, newspaper clippings, photos. But a simple question might be, can you tell me about this article or this photo? Or I found this and it tells this story. What do you remember about that? And sometimes they'll have perfect memory and they go, oh man, I completely forgot about that, but it reminds me of this and that. So, twofold process. The objects that you bring can elicit conversations, but also you might ask your interviewee if they have anything that they've kept from that time period. And you can say, did you keep a photo album? Do you have any recordings, videos? Do you have any scrapbooks? For me, who interviews a lot of clergy, they are pack rats. It's delightful. They've given me thousands upon thousands of artifacts. And it's just been amazing to go over it with them and to think with them about it. Oftentimes, you'll do your own archival research in advance and find things that you might share with them. See these as opportunities to provoke conversation, but also, as we're thinking about this, we're thinking like collectors. So you'll have your smartphone with you or some sort of camera. You'll take pictures of their objects. You'll ask their permission first, but this broadens and deepens our archive. So the oral history, we need to think about it as a multi-mediated experience where we start with a conversation, but oftentimes we're bringing objects for show and tell. Okay, so let's talk about the questions themselves. Oral histories are typically a combination of open-ended and closed-ended questions. Let's talk about the difference. I want you to think about for a moment, really effective classrooms that you've been in, either as a professor or as a student, and what made a conversation go well and what shut it down. In my experience, I found that open-ended questions that are debatable, that invite people to expand, to give the narrator space to respond in their own time, are far more effective at getting prolonged responses than yes/no questions or questions that have a definitive and short and specific response, right? So the way that you word a question will shape the answer that you get. So it's always best to ask a question that requires more than a one-word answer. So, here's an example. Did lesbians socialize at church? That's a yes/no question. Where did lesbians socialize in your congregation? How did you all meet each other? is very different because that's a how or a where. It gives a range of responses versus a yes, no. So I'll give you some examples of close-ended versus open-ended prompts. Did you belong to any gay organizations? Sure, yes, I did. Or what do you remember about gay organizations in your community? Were you out in your church? Yes or no answer. Versus, how did you come out in your congregation? They might say, well, I never did, and here's why, but it's a how question versus a yes, no question. Were there gay dances on your campus? That's from my campus oral history days when we were doing that. Versus what was LGBTQ social life like on campus? So open-ended questions start with phrases like, tell me about, can you describe, what do you remember about, can you help me understand, or what can you tell me about this? Oftentimes, if they start with something, you can say, can you say a little bit more about? What I really love is, as we're reflecting on something, how did you feel about whatever that thing is? All of these are basically inviting them to tell stories. And that's what we want, stories. So we're not there to sort of check off fact boxes only, but we can do some of that in addition to the open-ended question. We want to think about prompts that elicit stories, that elicit narrative, that are open-ended. So here's a few that I've asked over the years. And again, these questions could be about anything. Tell me about your journey to becoming ordained. Tell me about your journey to becoming ordained, right? So it invites them to narrate and offer a chronology. Tell me about your first crush, right? It's a nice way to get them to think about and reflect about desire and their sexuality and an origin point. Help me understand what services were like at your synagogue. What did officiating queer weddings mean to you? What's your favorite hymn and why? That's a two-part question. We're going to talk about two-part questions in a moment, but they're okay sometimes. So what we need to think about is oral histories as a funnel. They start big, they get narrow, and they go out again as we move from topic to topic. We think of them as a sequence of questions that start generally, elicit a story, and then we can follow up with more specific details as the interview progresses. Now, some funnels begin in the broadest terms, asking open-ended question, and as the narrator provides more specific answers, the interview asks close-ended questions until the details have been exhausted, and you end with yes/no responses. So most oral histories or many oral history interviews work as a series of funnel sequences. So I'm just going to respond to a question in the chat, and then we're going to talk about framing our questions a little bit. So Sarah asks, any advice on pitching the pre-interview request? And she notes that I'm thinking about the difficulty I've had getting people to set aside time for the interview itself, much less asking for them to meet with me twice. Yeah, this is always difficult. People's time is valuable. And oftentimes, sometimes you hit dead ends. Some folks won't speak with you. But I think that the way I do it is I sort of say to them, I came across your name here, or your story will be really valuable for my project, and you make them and you remind them why they're important. I think that sometimes you do two-parters, and you can say, would it be all right if we just set aside an hour, and if need be, we can set up a follow-up time, and you just book that on the day of as you finish, and then you follow up. Some folks are very gracious, others aren't. People are different. But I always emphasize how valuable their time is. I thank them profusely. I set up that pre-conversation right away. I thank them so much. So I convey as much warmth and enthusiasm as I can. And I try to welcome them into the project that I'm doing. I'm writing a story. I'm doing a podcast about this. I came across your name and I was so excited to find you. Would it be all right if we talked a little bit longer on this date? Might be my follow-up pitch. And so it's genuine and it's sincere. And I've done that with everyone from folks who we might consider allies to folks who are what we might call hostile to sexual variance or religious variance. But you have to remind them that their story matters for your project and you tell them like, your story will help us shape how other people understand it. You make clear the stakes. I'm trying to use this story to help tell a broader, narrative or history of X and Y. And here's why you matter. Can I please talk with you? And most people feel honored and flattered by that and will be welcoming. And some folks who are chary about it, sometimes it's usually a VIP. I tried to get Judy Bloom to talk to me at one point. She said no, and she was too busy. But most folks are pretty gracious about it. But as I think about it, I've had a few no's, quite a few no's, but it's okay. It's always a sort of shot in the dark. Okay, shifting back in again, please post questions in the chat and we'll keep moving. Thank you for that, Sarah. It's a great question. Okay, so as we think about sort of project-based oral histories, I tend to organize my open-ended questions around broad themes. So if I were to do like a church or synagogue LGBTQ history project, these themes might include for my subjects, say, the early childhood and family and religion of origin, their schooling and their religious education, maybe their first awareness of same-sex desires or trans identification. I might shift then to first romantic and sexual feelings and experiences, the process of coming out, either within or against their religious community, their relationship with their community in the past and now. Maybe I talk about their interactions or lack thereof with established queer social worlds or trans social worlds and cultures, both within and outside of their religious community. I might talk about their current religious life and sexuality and gender identity. And I might end with talking about their hopes for the future. So, sort of beginning, middle, and end. But again, we sort of think about these things as a sequence, hitting on key themes and chronologies, and you'll detail those as you go. Now, as you think about questions and a conversation with someone, my advice to you is to start with non-controversial questions. Don't just jump right into the hotspot, right? Think of it as a getting to know you process at first. And I would save the more delicate questions for when you and your narrator are better acquainted. And one of the things I'll say as an aside is that oral history is a kind of intimacy. They're trusting you with their story, and you're going to be a mensch and reciprocate in kind by being cautious and direct at the same time and careful with their feelings and the process of it. So for me, I always think that a good place, and I'm going to explain the contradiction there about both being cautious and direct in just a moment. It's not a contradiction so much as a bit of a balancing act. But I would say that a good place to begin is usually a childhood or an education place. So I might begin with something like this. Tell me about the religious journey that led you to whatever point that is, whether it's enrolling at a theological seminary, joining a church or a synagogue, whatever it is, tell me about a journey. Or when I was interviewing the folks for American Bandstand, and these were folks who were passionate about music and dancing, but also were closeted because they had to be in the 50s and early 60s. I started with them with a basic question, what kind of music did you love growing up? Tell me about that. Or how did you first hear about American Bandstand? We talked about music first. And then we talked about something like, then we shifted for, how did you first hear about gay people? Or what messages did you receive about same-sex sexuality growing up, right? And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment, about the language of sex and sexuality and the language of religion in just a sec. But for now, what I want to suggest is that we start with setting the scene and setting the context. If you share the topics in advance or the broad subjects in advance via email, that's okay too. So it gives them a sense to prepare and what to expect. And then you can follow up on these things. But I wouldn't just begin with like, tell me about coming out, right? We don't need to sort of start right there. We need to get at broader questions and get to know you. Not that these things are sensitive or delicate, but oftentimes questions evoke strong feelings and we need to be prepared for that. Okay. There's going to be a lot of sex if you're doing the history of sexuality in LGBTQ history. And I found in the past when I've given this workshop, especially to my graduate and undergraduate students, they're often very shy. Perhaps it's a phase of life. Perhaps they don't know how to talk about it with other people. but they're shy when talking about sex. And what I tend to say is a few things all at once. The first is it is okay to be direct. Your interviewee will set the tone. You don't need to be lurid. You don't need to be gross or explicit, but you can talk to them about, tell me about your first crush or your relationship, or where did people hook up on campus? Whatever the term is, you can ask them about it. And if they don't want to talk about it, they'll say, I don't really feel comfortable. That's okay. But most people know why they're in the room and are more than willing to share their stories. You'll adjust your questions based upon the tone they set. When we did a podcast episode on phone sex operators, like there was no mystique. Everyone knew why they were there. And I would say, what were some of your conversations like with your clients? And one of them started doing, most amazing and sultry voices, but went through the sort of things. And you got a little heated at times and it was fantastic. So one of the things that you want to do is you want to invite them to be direct and unashamed. If you're candid and okay with it, they will be too. The other corollary to that is you're going to be interviewing people from different generations. So there are many terms that have been used in the past and in the present to describe members of the LGBTQIA community. And people will use a variety of terms to describe themselves and others, right? So you can even ask them, what terms did you use at this time? What terms do you use now? That's totally okay. And you'll just honor the terms that they use and how they've chosen to describe themselves, and you'll work with them in that moment. Folks are often shy about this process, and it takes practice to get there. But again, being open and direct and respecting how they want to roll with that is totally okay. Now, again, I would just say that direct and relevant questions that are asked respectfully and on point work best. So I go in with the spirit of candor and openness. I'm curious about your life. I'm curious in how sexuality has played a role in it. I want to hear all about it. And we stay on point. So here are some questions I've asked my interviewees. How did you first hear about same-sex sexuality? Tell me about your first kiss. What messages did you receive in your congregation about sex? How did you first learn about sex? Two different questions. But these are okay things to ask, and the answers have been spectacular. Now, because we're also in a faith context and thinking about the histories of religion, one of the things that I would say, just as I would say this about the history of sexuality, is try to familiarize yourself with both the religious backgrounds and religious journeys of your interviewee and also their sexual backgrounds, if possible. So I try to do this, of course, before the interview, if possible. The more you can learn about their faith or their faiths, because people go on faith journeys, their religious vernacular, and the institutions and backgrounds that might have shaped their lives, the better. It can help guide your questions, and it also can make you sensitive to the dynamics informing their sexual journeys as well. For example, you might want to inquire, is their religion of origin open and affirming? What about their religion now? How does their religion of origin or their current religion understand sex, sexuality, and sexual variance? What about gender? What about the body? What traditions are they bringing with them? What weight are they carrying? How are they thinking about the world through their faith? And how are they thinking against their faith? These are worth looking at in advance, but also worth asking about. So I'm looking at the time. Now, normally at this time, I would do a small group exercise. I don't think we're going to have time for it right now, but typically what I would do is invite you to prepare 3 open-ended questions at this time. So we're going to just put a pin in that. But as you think about your own projects, what I'm going to say is be guided by your interests and be guided by your passion. One of the things, and this is in response to Andy Duncan's question about how to coax undergrads into talking to strangers, especially those who might be shy or not have a lot of experience doing that, is I tend to invite my students to think about, what are you most curious about? Here's this figure that you have just discovered, that you've found in the archive or in a newspaper or related to this project. What do you most want to know? If you could ask them anything, what would it be? and you begin to get them to go with their passion. Well, how would you ask that? And we frame the question from there. So it's a sort of way of brainstorming, and this is really where you begin. You begin with a brainstorm. What do you most want to know? What are you most curious about? What's most important to get them to think about? And then you structure questions on that. And just like anything else, I will say to my undergrads and grad students, good questions take time to develop. Take your time to write them, rewrite them, show them to your prof, show them to a friend, and think about how it would sound if someone asked you those questions, and then revise them accordingly. You might want to say, how would you want to be asked that question? And that's a way of getting them to think about it, right? And questions can sound really clunky at first. My early oral histories, I wouldn't call them train wrecks, but we could say that they were maybe slight fender benders. They were awkward. You get better over time. Okay, and Alina asked if I could elaborate a little bit on pre-sending questions and themes to the interviewees. And we'll talk about emotional, impactful events in a little bit. Okay, so what I will typically do is I'll send like a scaffold of like 10 questions, and I try to keep it at that because I don't want to overwhelm them. And I'll say, here are some broad topics or questions I want to ask, and it will sort of be thematically beginning, middle, end. I would love to hear about this kind of religious journey, how you first, and I'm giving examples from my own research. So and I'll come back to the American Bandstand one just because I've been talking about it. So it'll be something like, what did same-sex sexuality mean to you at this period? Who knew about your orientation, or how did you come out? How did you appear? Like, what was this? Tell me about the journey to appearing on American Bandstand. And then it might be a few other things like that. But it would be big thematic questions, key topics only. And then in my own sort of scaffolded um, worksheet, which you don't always expect to get to all of them, there would probably be about 30 questions, right? But I'd probably send them like 5 to 10 big questions, big topics. And the reason I do that, and I'd ask them in advance, do you want the questions? And then I just began sending them because it would prompt them and prepare them and get the motor running. And I'll say a little bit more about that. Memory work is hard work. It takes time to recall things. Narrating takes a few moments to get in place. So if you can start revving it at first and getting people primed, right, it helps the interviewer and interviewer on that day have a much more productive conversation. So don't overwhelm them with it. You don't need to feel obliged to send every question, but just broad topics, the most important ones that you really want to hit on, right? And again, you'll prompt them at the interview. If you have any objects, please bring them along. Okay, we'll talk about emotional, impactful things in just a minute. Okay, so we've talked about the prep, the questions themselves. Let's talk about technology and the interview itself. So you have your questions, you've arranged your interview, you've done the pre-interview with them, you've made sure that they're okay to do that. They've signed the release form, everything's on the ethical up and up. We're good to go. And I'm going to speak from experience here. Always make sure you have the right equipment, that you've tested the equipment, that you have a backup to the equipment. I've gone 40 minutes into an interview and realized that the first 40 minutes did not record. It is the most mortifying thing in the world, but we all make those mistakes. So what I'm going to suggest is to become familiar with your recording equipment. It could be software like Zoom, and Zoom is wonderful, especially if you have a transcription service on it, but there's also things like Descript and others that will transcribe your interview. Watch online tutorials and practice using your equipment a couple of times before you've done it. If you're doing something like the phone, and again, the technology you use is shaped by your interviewee's capacity. Some folks don't know how to use Zoom or don't have a computer. You'll use a phone. There's things like Tape-A-Call Pro, which is a great little app that you can download to your cell phone or your smartphone. And there's all sorts of other recording things that are very seamless and good to use. Just triple check. With Tape-A-Call, it has a 90-minute cap out unless you set it to record unlimited. I discovered that the hard way. So again, you practice with it, you test out your software. And what I tend to do is I tend to have a backup recording going. So in person, I might be recording with 2 recorders at once in case one fails, right? Or I might be, if I'm using Zoom and having it recorded, I use Audio Hijack, which records the Zoom in a separate software just in case. So you don't, so you should always have a backup plan. So there's RevCall, there's Tape-A-Call, but again, you're going to test your recording equipment. if you're doing in person, or even if you're not, please be plugged into a power source so that whatever you're using to record doesn't die, right? Or if you're having something battery powered, have backup batteries. Back in the day when we used tape recorders, we would change the tape and flip it midway through. With digital, it's unlimited now. I really just dated myself, but I am a middle-aged man and I used to use a tape recorder. That's how I started out, and now things are so much better. But again, it's better to rely on electricity than batteries. I often bring an extension cord with me to interviews just so that we can sit anywhere in the room. But these are just sort of handy dandy tricks to make sure that we can have the maximum effective interview setting. So again, pack an extension cord, make sure that your computer is plugged in or your phone is plugged in. You can have something like a dual charger and a headphone jack. But again, these are good things. Whichever technology you use, my advice is you use whatever medium your interview is most comfortable with. Your goal is to make it as easy as possible for them. If they're a phone person, go for it. If they're familiar with Zoom, go for it. When you're doing the interview, though, remotely like we are now, when they're speaking, mute yourself. It makes for better audio capture. It makes for less interruptions. Turn off anything that rings, dings, or what have you. The goal is to make the interview as professional as possible by scheduling an unhurried, and I'm going to say this, unhurried and private appointment with your narrator where you determine the length of the interview in advance. You should ask them if they have a quiet space where they can talk, or Zoom with you, or meet with you. And I found that interviews work best when it's just two people, the narrator and the interviewer. I've done group sessions before. Oftentimes, they just go off the rails and people will defer to one another. The dominant personality will take over. You don't necessarily capture the best out of everyone. I've also had situations where the spouse will be in the room and they'll go, no, 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 that's not how it was. Remember, it's this way. You don't want to be navigating those dynamics. One-on-one is great. When you begin the recording, and I have this in the guide as well, so I'm just going to go through it quickly, you're not going to remember in a year's time where the recording was and maybe even recognize the voice or the date. Record a lead at the beginning of the interview. This is Gil Frank interviewing so-and-so. The date is May 2nd, 2025. The interview is taking place via Zoom, right? Just put that at the top. It's good for the archivist. It's good for you. And then you have the person who you're interviewing state their name, their date of birth, their current address, if you want, their email address, just so you have all of this info in case some of it gets lost. It just helps you keep track of the metadata. Okay, so we're going to return to the ethics thing again. And I know Mark promised you a break, but I want to make sure we have maximum time. And so we're going to just roll a little bit fast and furious right now. At the top of the tape, and this is a technical term, this is called covering your ass. And this is for legal purposes, but also just for ethical purposes. You review their rights again, on tape. So I'll say, this is Gil Frank interviewing so-and-so. Here's the date. The interview is taking place here. And then I'll say something like to my interviewee, I just want to go over a few basic protocols with you one more time. I just want to make sure that you've reviewed and signed the oral history consent form. Have you? Yes, great. I want to make sure, once again, I have your permission to record our conversation today. Okay, great. We're being recorded right now. I want to let you know, and this is really crucial, I want to let you know that we can pause the tape or stop the interview at any time. Do you understand that? Great, fantastic. We can also go off the record at any time if there's something difficult you want to talk about privately before we go back on record. And I just want to remind you, if I ask you something you don't want to talk about, feel free to tell me just to buzz off. I won't get offended. You can feel free not to answer any questions that I ask. And most of the time, this isn't an issue. Sometimes folks want to go off the record just to talk about something delicate, and that's an opportunity to hit pause on the recording and then figure out how best to approach the subject. And I've used that to talk about difficult things, like someone who wants to talk about a former partner who was sexually violent. We wanted to figure out how to narrate that. Someone who they knew who wouldn't be comfortable being out. This is a different context. How do we talk about that? And we figured out ways to be constructive together. Now, if at all possible, I try to stay on the record as much as possible. I've had some very gossipy people who want to just keep off the go off the record. Oh, did you hear the story about so-and-so? It just interrupts the flow. So we try to stay on the record as much as possible, but we see these as points of contact where we figure out together how best to think about a topic. The key point of all this is that we have to respect the rights of our interviewees to refuse to discuss certain subjects, to restrict access, to choose pseudonymity or anonymity, and we go over these again, even if we've already done it in writing and the pre-interview. Okay, so we've got all that. The tape is rolling. We have our questions. What do we do? Now, we've all been in classrooms where the professor asks you 3 questions at a time. I call that the question sandwich. It's not a great approach. Don't ask your questions all at once. Don't ask compound questions. Try asking one question at a time, because usually the narrator, the interviewee, only ends up answering one of the 2 or the 3 questions, and the other ones get lost. So try to have brief questions, and most narrators will quickly grasp the kind of info that you're seeking. Tell me which prayers meant the most to you at that point in your life. Direct, straightforward question. Whereas, what were your favorite prayers, and why did you like them, and when did you pray? 3 questions all at once. Don't do that. Just one at a time. There's plenty of time to ask them slowly but surely. Right? Again, we start with non-controversial questions. We save the more delicate questions for later. And we can move forward to the more difficult questions. But I tend to start simple, background, and then I try to go chronologically whenever possible. Memory isn't chronological, but we can try to impose that order by eliciting questions and just be prepared to bounce back and forth. The goal is to go through your list of topics without interrupting, and I want to say this again, without interrupting the narrator or disturbing the flow of the interview. And that assumes that the narrator stays on topic. We'll talk about what happens when they stray far afield in a moment. But as they go, you're muted or you are like that. We're going to do active listening. We're going to not see this as a dialogue. It's not. You're not there to show how much you know. You're not there to talk about yourself. You're there to give them a platform to share their story, to elicit their best stories. So at the top, I limit my remarks to some small talk and make them comfortable. And then I begin with a prompt. Tell me about the church that you grew up in. Tell me about your journey that led you to seminary. And I have my opening question. And we go from there. And while they're talking, if it's like this on Zoom, I mute myself. They see me nodding along. They'll see me taking notes. They won't see me doodling, but I'm an active doodler. But what I'm actively doing is I'm making notes. I'll smile and nod, but I don't do things like go yes or uh-huh or mm. Some of us are emphatic and empathetic listeners. It sounds terrible on tape. Try to resist the urge. Try not to look bored or disinterested. I try to make eye contact while I take notes. I don't say things at the end of their comment like, oh, that's interesting. I don't end a sort of interaction with a value judgment. I'll usually just thank them, because if I forget to say that's interesting once, they'll think they were boring, right? We don't want to impose a sort of value into the response. But what I tend to do is I try to be reflective to elicit further comments. That sounds like a really challenging moment in your life. Thank you for sharing that. Or how did that moment make you feel? Might be a sort of follow-up for that. But typically I'll reflect back to them. Oh, thank you for sharing that part of your life. I wonder about this. And while they're talking, I'm thinking about my next question. The other thing I'm thinking about is, what have they just said that is confusing to me, or that a listener who's not in the know might need clarification? Oh, you use the term UU. What does that stand for again? Like, that's a really obvious one. But you want to just get them to explain things or follow up. Now, if a question occurs to you about something they said like 15 minutes ago, that's okay too. When there's a pause or a break in the conversation, you can say something like, I just want to return to something you said earlier. Can you say more about that? Right? Don't let periods of silence fluster you. So sometimes we get really nervous around pregnant pauses. I just gave a pregnant pause on purpose just to make everyone anxious. But for real, people take time to think. So if you hear a pause, I suggest that you count to 5 or 7 really slowly before asking the next question, because sometimes they're about to give you more and you've just rushed them off in a certain direction. Some of the best comments I've got have come after the pregnant pause. So we're going to do a pregnant pause together. We're going to count to 5 in our heads, and we're going to see how awkward and teeth grinding it feels. Okay? But in that time, they might think of something else. I found early in my academic career, I was just so anxious around pregnant pauses in the classroom. It just made my skin crawl. But now you just sort of lean into the silence and then people will inevitably say something. But truthfully, again, memory work is hard work. And in that pregnant pause, they are doing the work of recollecting or formulating or thinking about something. Again, don't let the silence fluster you. In the same vein, don't interrupt a good story or a bad story for that matter, just because you have a question or because they're saying something that's straying from that line. Just jot down your questions um, and leave it for later. Now, Tanya asks, what can be done if the interviewee won't answer the question in the complete sense, um, or if they briefly answer each and every question? Sometimes you have a bad interviewee, bad in the sense that they don't give you what you want. When someone gives a very brief answer, you can go, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. Or is there anything else you remember? Sometimes, it's hard to squeeze the juice out of them and they don't want to give. That's okay. Not every interview is a great interview. You just have to be comfortable that you gave them an opportunity and you invited it to them to sort of give their most. Sometimes that's all they remember. But you can say, is there anything else you'd like to share about that? But I just want you to feel comfortable asking, can you just say a little bit more? Is there anything else you remember? And if they're like, nope, that's it. All right, on to the next. Sometimes the interview will go for 15 minutes and you go, gosh, that was frustrating. But this is why I do the pre-interview, to get a sense of their style. Because I've driven 2 hours for an interview like that, and I was like, never again. Never going to do that again. Pre-interviews all the way from now on. Okay, so again, your list of questions is only a guide. It's not a rigid plan, so just be ready to ask follow-ups. Don't be afraid to extemporaneously ask something that occurs to you. Jot your notes down, write as you go, and then just be prepared to ask something about it. And sometimes, there'll be a surprising thing. So when I was doing my clergy interviews, I started with this question, and it was sort of an extemporaneous one. Oh, did you engage in any other forms of activism before you started abortion rights? And that interview ended up being 2 hours because I said, oh, yeah, I used to be active in the civil rights movement. I marched in Selma with Dr. King. I was there when Dr. or Reverend Reeb was killed in Alabama. And it led to all these other things. And that became part of my repertoire. Tell me about your activism prior to this, right? Extemporaneous questions can lead to really important questions that become part of the routine for a project. It's okay to have these things happen. And I'll just sort of say now, at the end of the interview, you'll write down a little note to yourself. I keep an interview diary, things that worked well, things that I might improve for next time. And you sort of recalibrate the questions as you go. Now, sometimes we have very unfocused, shall we say, interviewees, folks who aren't necessarily razor sharp, folks who like to talk about things as it occurs to them. And it's okay to sort of pause them. I let them go for about 5 minutes off the rabbit hole. And I'll say, okay, I just want to bring you back. It's very interesting about your pet cat and all the games they like to play. But I would love for you to say more about your activism at this congregation. Can you say a little bit more about that? You may have to do this multiple times. That's okay. I've had interviews go very long as a result of that. Now, don't be afraid to ask follow-up questions. They can be broad, they can be precise. Just saying, can you say more about X or Y is perfectly fine. A couple of tips as we sort of think about this. Most of you probably can't see my mic, it's hovering in the background. What I tend to do is I've tried to put the mic in a discrete location. If there's a book on the table, I'll put it beside the mic. I try to make this feel as much like a conversation as possible so that it feels intimate and human, not like that there's something in the face. So typically, I'll just put the mic sort of unobtrusively on the table or if it's a Zoom call like this, they'll just be seeing my face and it will sort of get lost in the moment. Phone calls I find have been the most intimate. So again, I would say the following. And this is sort of thinking about getting them to talk to us. It's often difficult if I were to say, tell me about your best friend. You might say a few things, but where would you begin? But what if I said to you, what did your best friend look like when you were in seventh grade together, or grade 7, depending on your region? They might begin by thinking about their haircut or their hairstyle, and then their personality traits after that. I don't know why it works, but I often begin with tell me about what they looked like, because the physical sometimes leads to the personality. All right. And it's just a neat way of getting them into it. I try to establish their role at important points in the story. Where were you during this debate? When did you realize that she liked you? Basically, it establishes how much of the narrative is based on eyewitness testimony and how much is based on secondhand information. Now, sometimes people will say stuff that is wrong, that is inaccurate, that is just strange. Your job is not to challenge them. Your job is not to correct them. If they're struggling for a word or an event or a year, your job is not to fill that in. That alters the dynamic. Your job is to develop as much information as possible, and then that can be used by yourself or later researchers to establish what might have actually happened. But one thing I tend to do is I'll say, it's funny, I've heard a different account or I've read a different account. What do you think of that? This doesn't challenge them or say you're wrong, but it suggests that there's other stories in existence and it offers them their own take. So again, you don't need to correct the year in person. You don't need to correct them. Your job is to welcome their version of events and their feelings about it. Okay, so when we conclude the interview, some folks might say things like, have a signature conclusion. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to share with me? Or, we've talked about all these things. If you can imagine a next generation learning from your story, what would you most want them to learn? That's one of my favorites. What would you most want someone hearing this to take away from our conversation today? Some of my students have said, what do you wish you had known back then that you know now? And then after we do that concluding question, I thank them again for sharing their stories with me. I ask them permission to follow up with them if anything else comes out, and I move on. I also ask them, and this is snowballing, who else do you think I should speak with? And is it okay if I take pictures of these documents that you might have brought with you, or do you have anything that you want to share with me? Now, this is the part of the thing as we come to our own conclusion of our time together. And again, you should be putting your questions in the chat now because, we will all have to move on with our lives very shortly. This is the part I like to call being a mensch, which is to say being a decent human being. Pay attention if your interviewee is becoming tired. You can ask them when there's a natural pause if they want to continue or if they want to take a break. Some interviews last 2, maybe 3 hours. I try to sort of say at the 70-minute mark, 75-minute mark, is it okay? Do you want to continue? And if it's possible for them, and if it's possible for you, you can respect those wishes. But I try to cap it at 1 to 2 hours because there is a finite time that some people can talk and you're not getting their best selves. Now, let's talk about dealing with challenging situations. There are difficult interviewees that can be rude or verbally abusive. You don't need to sit there for that. No interview is worth being in a difficult or hostile situation. And I say this to my students all the time. If it feels weird or strange, end the interview. Tell them you have to go wash your hair, do whatever you need to say. Say whatever you need to say. Just leave. It's not the end of the world if you don't capture this story. And some of my students have interviewed what we would call creepy people. And I've guided them to say, you don't need to be there. And some of them have left. I've learned this from experience where we had an awkward situation. Folks are going to talk about difficult and traumatic points. I've had interviewees talk about being harassed, being stalked because they were abortion providers. They've talked about difficult moments in their lives that were, heartfelt and also hurtful moments. And the interview will drag up some things for them. One of my interviews said, I haven't slept for the past day or two thinking about the stories that I want to tell you, right? This was an abortion provider who survived sort of the violence of the late 80s, early 90s and the anti-abortion movement. And my job is not to be a therapist, but my job is to be sympathetic. I'm not a therapist. I can't offer them healing or counseling. What I can do is thank them or reflect with them about the feeling process for the record as much as they want to. Now, there are going to be things that might be evocative for you, and that's for you to work with your own support networks and communities, and you need to be aware of that. But as we sort of invite them to participate as informed, consenting adults, everyone in the room is responsible for their feelings, and you thank them for their time. You reflect back on them. If they get emotional, you say, I can see you're getting emotional right now. Talk to me about that if they want. And they will, because it is a process of talking about the feeling of history and memory. And that's the best I can offer you with that. I think that, there is some good guidance on the Oral History Association. We do all of these screenings with our IRBs in advance to talk about sensitive subjects and difficult subjects and how we approach them. And we make sure they're comfortable sharing it with the archives. And we remind them that they are free to pull parts of the interview as they want. Now, we can't control the feelings of others, but we can control how we respond to it. And how I advise responding is with dignity. Thank you for sharing that part of your life. That sounds like a really momentous time for you, or that sounds really challenging. I really value that you shared that with me. I dignify it and I honor it. Okay? Now, every interview is different. What I say is, again, we're going in with our curiosity. We're leading with our compassion. I'm going to just say a couple of other things very briefly, and then I'm going to return to some of the questions in the Q&A. Keep an interview diary. Note what worked and what didn't. When you finish an interview, revise your questions within a couple days so that you can remember what worked and what didn't. Consider incorporating new questions based on new insights. I'll give an example. I was interviewing this rabbi who was, again, an abortion provider and helped folks find abortions. And he said, I was thinking about the questions you sent me, and nowhere in there did you ask, how did any of this make me feel? And I want to tell you that. And I said, oh my goodness, I never asked them about their emotional lives. I'd done 20 interviews at that point. And from then on in, I would say, how did this process make you feel? And he gave me sort of guidance. And so learning by doing and learning as you do go is perfectly okay. Send thank you notes. Always send thank you notes. Thank you for your time. I will love to keep you updated. Please keep in touch. May I keep in touch with you? Again, be a mensch. I can't emphasize this enough. Make copies, back up your files, label your files, have them in triplicate. Use an external hard drive or cloud, but again, keep backups. I'm going to just, that is it for me in terms of all the things I want to offer you. I'm going to put a file back in the chat and then I'm going to get to your questions. Again, many of these things that I said today are in this file that I put in the chat. Now, Gail Biederman asks, with undergrads, Gen Z, their very definitions of what it means to be LGBTQIA or queer is very different from older generations. But basically, what do we have any advice for dealing with difference and advice on how to take advantage of the disparate assumptions in our students' interviews? So one of the things that we do in the pre-research section is we try to find out about how they made meanings of their lives. And what I say to my students who are coming from a very different generational viewpoint than even my own, right? Not like I was born in the 70s, I'm a 90s kid. My students are completely different than the sort of worldview that I grew up in, right? Nobody was out, for example, in my high school. People only started coming out later. It's a different worldview in a different way. Trans people weren't as visible then as they are now. Things change over time. But I try to get them in the framework for thinking. Our goal is to find out is how do they feel and think about this? What are their assumptions? So ideally, when we do oral history projects, they have some priming and prompting from secondary readings, but also as they formulate their questions, our goal is to get them to explain their lives and their identity as appropriate to the topic. And so I always remind them, like, our worldview is not their worldview. We're putting on our time machine or historian's hat here. Let's get them to talk about and narrate how they thought about themselves as much as possible in that moment. And we can ask this in a sort of circular way. Tell us about sort of what words and language you used, what terms were used for queer people, what terms were used in your church and synagogue. How did you identify then? You might even say, how do you identify now? Right? But we go in with this sort of spirit of open-ended questions. I'll see if there are any other questions. And Isaiah, if you want to copy and paste any of them that I might have missed, that would be great. But if you have any other questions, this is the time for them. This is what we call the 5-second pause. We can open up the mics, Isaiah, if anyone wants to do it that way, if they don't want to type. Or they can do the hand raising function and you can call on them. All right. I think that I'm not a believer in pulling teeth with these sorts of Q&As. So thank you so much for joining me. My contact information, I believe, is on the guideline, but you can find me at the Trinity College website as well, frankg@tcd.ie. I'd be delighted to hear from you. If there was any follow-ups, I'll do my best to answer them. But again, I'm wishing you lots of luck with your oral history projects, with your teaching and your scholarship. Go in with your curiosity and your compassion. Y'all are going to do great at it. I'll stick around for a couple seconds in case anyone wants to say hi.
Let me just thank everybody for sticking around. We'll just stay on for a couple of minutes if anyone wants to make a final comment. Go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say thank you very much. I am an undergrad student currently at the University of Dayton and doing research on LGBTQ plus Catholic topics as I'm on a Catholic Marinus campus. And this was really helpful. The professor I'm working with was on at the beginning and she had to leave for a different call. But she was like, I hope you got like good information out of it. She was like, it's one of the she's a sociologist and she was like, it's one of the best trainings on this topic that I've seen. So I just wanted to thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very kind.
Yeah.
And good luck with your fantastic sounding topic.
Thank you. Thank you.
I've asked enough questions, but I have one question. When you do oral histories with undergrads, can you tuck it into a course like on LGBTQ history, or is it better as a whole oral history class? How have you done it? Have you done it both ways?
So I have done it in a class on LGBTQ history, and I found it worked very well. But I had to reserve about 5 weeks of the semester for it. So it's 7 weeks of learning LGBTQ history, and then 5 weeks of doing oral history methods and giving them time as assignments within the week of one oral history per week because they couldn't fit it in. Next
Can I
year,
ask one?
oh, I'm sorry, Gail, go ahead.
And then with the oral histories they take, do they do anything with them? Do they put them in the archive? Do they put them online? Do they make a book out of them? I mean, what's the?
So I'll talk to you about the process. So I tend to want to have it in the context of a repository at the school library or a local library. So storage is really important for that. And so here's what we're doing right now over at Trinity, and we're in collaboration with some other schools. We're launching an Ireland-wide LGBTQ oral history project, and that's sort of in correlation with Trinity's own. So it's a 4-university partnership sponsored by Dublin City Council. Imagine that, like government getting involved in sponsoring it. It's fabulous. The Irish Archives and National Archives are going to be storing it. So we've taken care of repositories, and it's going to be occurring in the context of a master's level graduate class on LGBTQ oral histories, where there's going to be the theory section for the first 5 weeks of the semester and sort of like the training. And then the final 6 weeks, it's going to be them doing 1 to 2 oral histories per week for about 3 or 4 of the weeks, and then the write-ups afterwards. And so we're setting it up as a very scaffolded thing with specific targets, and it's still very much in development, but it's pretty much the first few weeks of the semester are getting them acquainted with both context and then methods. And I think that's really crucial to have them have some sense of LGBTQ oral histories. When we did this at Princeton, we did a Princeton University LGBTQ oral history project. Their website, by the way, is just fantastic with what they've done with it. They spoke with archivists, and Princeton has more money than you can imagine. So their resources were just amazing. They had it set up with the library to store it, to digitize it, and then they created audio and video clips along with it that are basically professional level. They've organized it thematically. So thinking about oral history in a sort of undergraduate class as project oriented, I find is very, very helpful, very useful, and thinking about things like storage and what it might mean. So I do think that when they're doing this labor, having a way of storing it and disseminating it and curating it is always a good thing to consider. And so it might be sort of seen as a scaffolded project that you're sort of the PI or lead director that can be done over a number of years, or something that's a one-off. It depends sort of on the specificity of it. All right. On that note, I will stick around for if anyone else wants to do it, but so lovely to see some of your faces, no, all of your faces that I could see, those of you showed them. And thank you all for these great questions and for participating. I'll look forward to hearing about your brilliant oral history projects going forward.